Well, this morning we're going to take a break from Romans, and we'll pick it up again in January. I'm excited about that. And next week we start a multi-part Christmas series on gifts God gives from the Gospel of John. You're going to love it. But today what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about something that when I look back, I was really surprised. When I look back through all of my sermons over the years, I realized I had never done a message just on this topic. And I was a bit, not only surprised, but a bit ashamed because it is a central part, though James River has been very, very involved in ministering to the poor through the years. It's been a big part of what we do. It's a big part of what the season of giving is. It's our benevolence in the community is well known because of your generosity. Yeah, that's right. And yet I realized that I'd never spoken exclusively. I've mentioned it in sermons, but never spoken exclusively on having a heart for the poor. This is something that is incredibly relevant for us in Southwest Missouri. In the state of Missouri, the poverty rate across the state is 18.6% of the residents of this state live in poverty. And we would define poverty this way. No, can you give me the other slide there? We would define poverty this way. A one-person household that makes $12,400, a two-person household that makes $15,000 annually, and so forth. If that's your total income, then that tells you, depending on how many live in your home, whether you're in poverty. In the Springfield area, in the city limits, 32.9% of people in Springfield live in poverty. That is absolutely shocking. Let's put numbers to it. If we take the population of just Springfield, you're talking 55,000 people live in poverty. 1 in 3 live in poverty in the Springfield area. If you go down to Jasper County, which is Joplin, the poverty rate is slightly less, but it's still nearly a third. 29% of people live in poverty. If you put numbers to that, that's almost 34,000 people in the Joplin area that live in poverty. And again, as I said, in the state of Missouri, 18% is the poverty rate. So in the next few moments, what I want to do, not just because of the statistics that we read regarding our state or our cities, but because of what the Word of God says, I want to talk to you in the next few moments about biblically why we should have a heart for the poor. Let me give you 3 reasons. First, because God has a heart for the poor. God cares for the poor. Nearly 2,000 verses in the Bible deal with the poor. 2,000 verses. Now, I'm only going to cover about half of them in the sermon, but Deuteronomy chapter 15. But if there are any poor Israelites in your towns when you arrive in the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. God's heart and his instruction to his people is that when it comes to the poor, there's no place for being hard-hearted or tight-fisted. Instead, be generous and lend them whatever they need. Give generously to the poor, not grudgingly, for the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. This is what God is saying, that you and I don't have to be afraid to be generous with the poor, because when we do that, God takes note, and God says, when you're generous with them, I'll be generous with you. When you help the poor, he'll help you. Look at it in Psalm chapter 41 and verse 1. Oh, the joys of those who are kind to the poor. You know, we talk about having joy. Some people, we live in a society, in a country that is increasingly depressed, that is increasingly sad. Maybe the best antidote for us as a nation is to do more in the way of sharing with people around us. Having a heart for the poor. Oh, the joys of those who are kind to the poor. The Lord rescues them when they're in trouble. So when you're in trouble, God rescues you because God says, you've been kind toward the poor. This is all over the scripture. Proverbs 22 and verse 9. A generous man will himself be blessed. Why? For he shares his food with the poor. One of the marks of generosity is not just what we give the Lord. Now, let me say this. When we're talking about giving to the poor, the tithe, the first 10% of our income belongs to the Lord, belongs to his house. It's for the maintenance of the house of God, the ministries that take place, the discipling of children, the discipling of adults, the preaching of the gospel. So we tithe, but then over and above that, there's missions offerings, there's alms, which ALMS, which is gifts to the poor. And what God says is that we're more generous in our gifts to the poor, what we do for the poor. God says we're going to be blessed. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 27, whoever gives to the poor will lack nothing, but those who close their eyes to poverty will be cursed. In other words, when you see a need, there has to be this awareness. God is watching you and I as we're watching people. And when we see a need, if we turn away from the need and we're like, oh, I didn't see that, or I don't want to see that, or I don't want to look, or I'm going to ignore that, or I'm not going to think about it because I'm so busy thinking about myself, then what happens is it automatically removes us from a place of blessing in the eyes of the Lord. Here's another verse, Proverbs 19 and verse 17. If you help the poor, you're lending to the Lord. When you give money to the poor, when you help the poor, God views it this way. It's like you lend it to him. You didn't just give it to them, you gave it to him. Remember that, because we're going to deal with that at the end of the message when we come to Matthew 25. Jesus is going to say, when you did it to the least of these, my brothers, you did it unto me. God says, when you help the poor, it's like you helped him. Jesus says, when you did something for somebody who was poor and in need, it's like you did it for him. If you help the poor, you're lending to the Lord, and he will, watch this, repay you. How many know God is going to repay you back more than 100%? That God is going to do more for you than you ever do for him. That God is never going to owe a man or a woman anything. Proverbs 21, verse 13. Those who shut their ears to the cries of the poor will be ignored in their own time of need. Listen, if you want to make sure God hears you, make sure your ears are attentive to the poor, that you're hearing the cry of the poor. Proverbs 14, those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but helping the poor honors him. There's a lot more at stake than just, do I agree with a panhandler sitting at an intersection? It's a lot more at stake than, well, if they just get off meth, they wouldn't be so poor. Listen, ours is not to sit and render a judgment on how they got there, why they're there, and how they can get out of there. Ours is to look through eyes of compassion, because that's the heart of God, and to recognize that when we honor the poor, this is the Christian ethic. When we do it for them, it's like we're doing it for him. It's like we're honoring God. God has a heart for the poor. And the way we treat the poor determines how God treats us. If we're generous, God will be generous. But if we hold back, God will hold back. This is God's heart for the poor. When you go to the New Testament, you see it again. Jesus announces his gospel ministry with this declaration. Listen to it. Luke chapter 4, verse 18. He gets up in the synagogue. He unrolls the scroll. He's going to read for that day, the reading for that day. So it's not like he's thumbing through the scroll trying to find the place. No, he's at the right time, at the right place. God has him in Nazareth. He unrolls the scroll, and these are the first words he speaks. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. The inauguration of his ministry is one that says, listen, and I know people are going to say, well, he's talking about the poor in spirit. Yes, but he's also talking about the poor, period. He starts with that. It's a part of his ministry, though he is living the life of an itinerant preacher, dependent upon offerings. He's taking the offerings he receives, and he's directing that they be given to the poor. We know that because we read this about Judas in John chapter 13. On the night Jesus is betrayed, Jesus tells Judas, whatever you're gonna go do, go do it. And Judas since he was their treasurer, some thought Jesus was telling him to go and pay for the food or to give some money to the poor. In other words, it was common for Judas to give money to the poor. So they thought, well, he's going out to give people, the poor, some money at Passover. Here's something that's very interesting in Galatians, because you see how the apostles, how the early church thought about the poor. Paul has been preaching the gospel. Paul's concern is, as he's preaching the gospel, because he hasn't had any meaningful sit-downs with the apostles, because he's gotten his gospel personally from the Lord Jesus Christ on Mount Sinai in Arabia, and now he's preaching the gospel, and Paul's concern is, I hope that as I'm preaching the gospel, my gospel's matching their gospel. Paul is a man who wants unity. So he goes to Jerusalem. He meets with James, Peter, and John. This is Paul telling that. They encouraged us to keep preaching to the Gentiles while they continued their work with the Jews. Their only suggestion was that we keep on helping the poor, which I have always been eager to do. In other words, here's the take on the apostles. Yes, preach the gospel, but don't forget the poor. How important is our care for the poor, our awareness of the poor, our ministry to the poor, then that the apostles are saying, listen, yes, get out there, preach the gospel, but whatever you do, don't forget the poor, because if you forget the poor, something has been lost in your preaching of the gospel. We can never get to a place as believers where all we care about, though it is the most important, to preach the gospel. But we cannot lose sight of our responsibility to the poor. So we should have a heart for the poor because God has a heart for the poor. It's the second thing I want you to notice. Every person is valuable and precious in God's sight. Every human being is made in the image of God. That's what makes human beings different from animals. Animals don't have a spirit that has eternality and the ability to relate to God in the same way. They're not made in the image of God. Now, I realize that's probably another article for the news leader, but it's true. I shouldn't have said that, okay. Okay. We treat people with respect, with dignity, with care, with concern, with conversation, with interaction. Everybody. Not people who are just like us, but everybody. Especially people who are in need. Because they most need to know that they matter. They're the ones who most need to know that there's a God who sees them. There's a God who cares for them. And we can be his hand extended to them. When you come to Isaiah chapter 58, it's a chapter on fasting, only it's a different kind of fasting. It's not the kind of fast where you abstain from food. It's a chapter on the kind of fast that involves caring for the poor. The picture is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. It is still observed in Israel today. Back then, the high priest would offer sacrifices for his sin, for the sins of the people, and then for the only time in the Jewish calendar year, he would take the blood of those sacrifices, he would go back behind the curtain into the most holy place. Only time he would go into the most holy place, and he would sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat to atone for sin. And the people would take the day and they would go without food and they would fast. And the chapter starts with the people saying to God, we're fasting, but we don't feel you're responding to us. And there's this dialogue, this interaction where God explains to them what the problem is. Look at it in verse 2, Isaiah 58. Yet they act so pious. They come to the temple every day and seem delighted to learn all about me. They act like a righteous nation that would never abandon the laws of God. They ask me to take action on their behalf, pretending they want to be near me. Listen, it's possible to go to church every Sunday. It's possible to dot your I's and cross your theological T's, and yet have an attitude regarding the poor that separates you from the blessing of God in your own life. Look at it in verse 3. We have fasted before you, they say. Why aren't you impressed? We have been very hard on ourselves, and you don't even notice it. I'll tell you why, I responded. That's the Lord speaking. It's because you're fasting to please yourselves. Even while you fast, you keep oppressing your workers. In other words, when you're fasting, it's all very self-focused, self-centered. God is not interested in personal religion that's only about you. Our relationship with God, having received from Him, should cause us to say, you did so much for me. How can I take the generosity I've received from you and multiply it into the lives of others that they might see you and me and they too might come to know you? Look at it in verse 4. What good is fasting when you keep on fighting and quarreling? This kind of fasting will never get you anywhere with me. You humble yourselves by going through the motions of penance, bowing your heads like reeds bending in the wind. You dress in burlap and cover yourselves with ashes. Is this what you call fasting? Do you really think this will please the Lord? Then he says in verse 6, no, this is the kind of fasting I want. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. Let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind people. In other words, what he's saying is, I care about justice for people who are unjustly treated. And in this particular case, he then defines it, though we could go a lot of directions with that, and it would be contextual and it would be meaningful. In this chapter specifically, watch where he goes, verse 7. Share your food with the hungry. Do you realize that people being in poverty is not just a shame? It's unjust. I mean, that there's something wrong with that. That there's something that has to be done about that. He says, give shelter to the homeless. Give clothes to those who need them, and do not hide from relatives who need your help. Now, I want to take just a moment, and because as do not hide from relatives who need your help, you know, it would go without saying that you would help those who are near you, your family members. That when it comes to helping the poor, if you have family members who are poor, you have a responsibility to help them, biblically speaking. In fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith. In other words, you're worse than an unbeliever. It's like you don't even know Christ. So there is that responsibility to those to whom we are related. But what he's talking about here is he's saying, I want you to act justly, and justice means that verse 7, you share your food with the hungry, you give shelter to the homeless, and to what degree, how do you do that? Look at it in verse 10. Pour yourself out for the hungry. I mean, in other words, there is a giving that is just like pouring it, not measuring it out, not, listen, should you put coins in the red kettles? Sure, that's great. But what I want to do is keep anybody from the illusion that somehow because you put 2 quarters in the kettle, you've cared for the poor. That's not what we're talking about here. I also think it could be safe to say that because you gave in a season of giving offering, or because you gave money to Victory Mission, or Ozarks Food Harvest, or Crosslines, or any number of the incredible agencies, and we're very blessed in this area to have so many agencies that minister to people, the idea is that you pour yourself out, and we're not just talking about money, we're talking about you. That what God is calling us to is not just a writing of the check, though that is important because it takes money to help people. But there's not just a writing of the check, there's the extending of compassion by way of personal interaction and conversation with people that engages people as human beings. Does what we can do. And everybody can do this, because listen, 55,000 people in Springfield, 34,000 people in Jasper County. Listen, nobody's got to look very far to find somebody who needs something, and you can engage them. And it can be something, sometimes it's a little more simple, sometimes it's a little more complicated, but I would advocate that always to be able to engage the person is what the Lord wants. Sometimes it's impossible, but to engage them conversationally, to find out what's happening, to be aware of others' needs around you, looking for opportunities. The poor need money. There's no question about that. But more than money, they need to know they have value. That they're not just a case that's come before you, but they're a person whom Christ died for. Now look at it in Isaiah 58 and verse 7. Share your food with the hungry, give shelter to the homeless. And now what it does is it amplifies this. Give to others, give to those who need them, and do not hide from relatives who need your help. 2 things I would say. First of all, do not hide. What we're talking about is availability. Sometimes, as I said, you can find yourself in a place where you're looking the other way. You're like, I don't know that I can do anything about that. I don't know if I don't want to do anything about that, so I'm not going to do anything about that. So we kind of look and think about other things. You're at the intersection, and so instead of engaging, helping, doing something, you're like, I think I'm going to call my wife, and so you're dialing the phone or you're looking away. The idea is that we would not, we would be, let me put it this way, we'd be a first responder. That's what Christians are called to be. We're first responders. Here's the thing about a first responder. When a first responder comes up on the scene of an accident, they're not getting their little tape measure out to measure how long the skid marks are so they can figure out who they're going to treat first and how much treatment they're going to give them. The first responder comes and says, people are injured, people are dying. I'm going to help them, and I'm going to give them all the help I can possibly give them to be able to save them. Listen, when we're seeing people where they're at, then we're the first responder. We want to, people are dying, people need Jesus, and people need to know how much he loves them, and I'm going to do whatever I can to administer the first aid of the cross to their situation, and the love of Christ to them to whatever degree is in my power and is helpful to them. But then would you notice it says, and do not hide from relatives. That's a really unfortunate, very unusual translation, because everywhere else that phrase is translated in the Hebrew, it says, and proclaim to the people. The idea is that not so much relatives, the Jewish people would have understood they care for their relatives. The issue is that when you and I are offering compassion, what we're doing is we're proclaiming to people that we are one with those people, and that is a very, very valuable thing. That we're acknowledging that, listen, we are one race. We're the human race. And I don't care what the color of your skin is. I care about you because you are made in the image of God. And we may be from different backgrounds. We may have a different set of values, but we can agree on this. We're human beings, and I love you, and I care for you. Christ died for me, and he died for you, and I want you to know it. And whatever I have to do to demonstrate his love for you, I'm going to do it within my power. I'm going to pour myself out. The idea is that we recognize our oneness, and when out of that, proclaim to them that. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 2 says this, the rich and the poor have this in common, the Lord made them both. Which certainly reminds us nobody's better than anybody else. You may have more in the grace of God and the care of God than the person beside you, or the people you're going to meet in this month as you shop, or as you travel places, or as you work. But God made you and God made them, and we're all part of the human family. And because of that, we have a responsibility to people around us. In a sense, we treat them as if they were our own family, because they are. There's a third thing I want you to see. God has a heart for the poor. People are valuable. And number 3, we were poor, and God graciously and generously gave to us. So on the Day of Atonement, the priest is offering the sacrifice, and then the people are fasting. And what it was to say to them was, it was to remind them that on their own they could never save themselves, that all their good works, all of their nice thoughts would never make them right before God. There had to be blood sacrifice pointing to Jesus Christ, who would be the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. And then there would be this humble acknowledging that, you know what, I'm a sinner. And this desire to be right with their fellow man. So even today on the Day of Atonement in Israel, the Jewish people who observe it will think of people that might have something against them or somebody that they wronged, and they'll try to do reconciliation on that day across the nation. But what they were doing in Isaiah 58 is they were having that one day, but then the rest of the year, they're living selfishly in a self-centered way. And here's what God is saying. God is saying, if you really understood my grace, and if you really knew what I have done for you, when you saw a need, you would try to meet it. This is the basis of Christian compassion. That we of all people have experienced the grace of God in an incredible, in an unquantifiable manner. That the King of glory, who was rich for our sakes, became poor. That he came and he laid down his life for us. He gave everything for you and I. And he suffered and he bled and he died an unjust death for us. He gave us a righteousness we did not have and we could not have attained on our own. All of us, in a very real sense, were spiritual beggars, but now God, through His grace, emptied Himself, took us and adopted us as His own, and now we are children of the King. We had nothing, and now we have everything. We are huge debtors to Him. And when we understand what He has done for us, then we will automatically seek to demonstrate that toward others. If Jesus loved us so much that He gave us everything, when you understand that, then you say, you know what, I gotta love other people that way. It would be summed up, Jesus said, freely you've received, freely give. Now watch this play out in the New Testament, because this is the basis of Christian generosity. In fact, let me just say this. If you aren't generous, it's because you do not understand the gospel. You say, oh, I understand the gospel. If you're not generous, you don't understand it. You can say it, you got it up here, you don't have it here. You understood He died for you. You just don't understand the enormity of the gift that was. You don't understand the poverty that you had. You don't understand the gospel, because when a person understands the gospel, to the degree you and I understand the gospel is the degree to which we will operate in generosity. Look at it, 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. We know what real love is because Jesus gave up His life for us. So when we really understand what Jesus did and the enormity of His gift, watch this, so we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. Is He talking about standing in front of somebody who's getting ready to get shot and taking the bullet? It could be that, but for most people, it's not going to be that. For most people, the laying down of our lives is going to be the denying of ourselves. So instead of doing something for us, we use that resource to do something for somebody else. Look at it. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need, but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? I mean, if when you see people around you and they're hurting and they're suffering, and you're like, well, that's too bad. Or worse. I saw a help wanted sign up the road. If you want a job, get one. Or, you know what, I've stopped and talked to those people before, and they say, you know, we'll work, but when you offer them a job, they don't want work because it's just a big sham. Or the person who says, well, you know what, you're sitting at a street corner and you're taking money from people. I figured it up, and if you make X amount and all the things. If that's where you're at, then you're living far beneath the level of God's calling as a Christian. He says, how can God's love be in that person? Listen, the issue is not, the issue is only how they got there if you're wanting to hear their story. Listen, the issue is they're there. And it's cold in the winter and it's hot in the summer. And when you don't have a change of clothes or you're hungry, you're hungry. And if you're trying to get from here to Oklahoma City and you don't know how you're going to do that, that's a problem. That's what I'm saying. And it says this, dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let's show the truth by our actions. Close with the scripture, although I'm not closing yet. Matthew 25, it's the last of Jesus' parables of his ministry. It's a apocalyptic. It's a grand, it's a fearsome, almost a shocking moment. It's interesting. This is the last parable Jesus tells his disciples before he goes to the cross. Matthew 25, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit upon his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered in his presence, and he will separate the people as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, the sheep, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then these righteous ones will reply, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will say, "I tell you the truth. When you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me." He who's kind to the Lord, remember? Or kind to the poor, lends to the Lord, and the Lord will repay him. That person at the bus stop on the street corner, that person, that neighbor that you know, listen, when you're helping them, you've helped Jesus. It's the mark of a righteous person that they help people. Now listen carefully. Jesus is not saying, if you want to be saved, help the poor. What he is saying, if you are saved, you will help the poor. I want to ask you a question. How's that working in your life? Are you pouring yourself out? Listen, let me say this. Helping the poor, our tithe belongs to the church because that maintains the ministry. So there's tithe, and then there's missions giving, there's alms, ALMS, which is gifts to the poor. But when's the last time that you needed a coat, but you said, you know what, I'm gonna take this money I'd spend on a coat, and I'm gonna make sure people have a coat? And when's the last time you said, you know what, I'm gonna do more than drop some money in the offering. I'm gonna find a family and I'm gonna adopt them, and not just adopt them for Christmas, but I'm gonna adopt them for as long as they will allow me to be there to help them, to encourage them. And I'm not doing it, I hope it is beneficial over time, because I'm telling you, in most instances, it will be some. You won't ever see it this side of heaven. But the call is to pour ourselves out. Let me encourage you, give through the church, give to the other agencies that help people, but don't let that keep you from personally interacting with people in need. I close with a portion of a message that Robert Murray McCheyne, great Scottish preacher in the 1800s, preached in the 1830s to his congregation from the biblical text, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." McCheyne said this: "Now, dear Christians, some of you pray to be made in the image of Christ. If so, you must be like him in giving. Though he was rich, for our sakes he became poor. Objection. My money is my own. Answer. Christ might have said, my blood is my own, my life is my own. Then where should we have been? Objection. The poor are undeserving. Answer. Christ might have said the same thing. They are wicked rebels against my Father's law. Shall I lay down my life for these? But no, he gave his blood for the undeserving. Objection. The poor may abuse it. Answer. Christ might have said the same with far greater truth. Christ knew that thousands would trample his blood under their feet, that most would despise it, that many would make it an excuse for sinning more, yet he gave his own blood. Oh, my dear Christians, if you would be like Christ, give much, give often, give freely to the poor, the thankless, and the undeserving. Christ is glorious and happy, and so you will be. It is not your money I want, but your happiness. Remember his own word. It is more blessed to give than to receive.